I knew the exact moment my name died in that room. It wasn't when the proposal hit the screen with Greg's name stamped at the bottom. It wasn't even when he stood there, all puffed up like a knockoff motivational speaker, pacing back and forth in his brown loafers like he'd cracked some ancient corporate code. No, it was when the CFO nodded slowly, squinting at the deck, and said, "Smart work, Greg. This could actually fix the vendor bleed." That was my moment. The one that told me everything I needed to know about how things worked at Trinican Systems. I'd stayed up until 2:47 a.m. for 2 weeks running the numbers. I'd scoured contract databases, run side-by-side comparisons of vendor redundancies, and cross-referenced invoice trails like a forensic accountant on Adderall. And what did I get? Seat 3 chairs away from the coffee machine and a cold packet of trail mix from the HR fridge. Greg hadn't even opened the dashboard I built. He just asked to glance at my findings last Friday for visibility and then went radio silent all weekend. On Monday morning, he was suddenly leading an operational audit task force. The kicker, they invited me to the meeting as note taker. "Anna, would you mind capturing some of this for the wiki?" Greg asked, not even looking at me. I was already seated, laptop open. My name wasn't on the slide deck. My name wasn't on the summary printouts. My name didn't exist in the room, and everyone knew it. I looked up once, just to watch his hand gesture toward the screen like he was auditioning for a B-list infomercial. By consolidating legacy, vendor contracts across our Tier 2 operational regions, it can generate a projected annual savings of $2.1 million, he said, and I could feel it like a slap. That number, that precise phrasing. Word for word what I wrote in the executive summary last Wednesday night. I should have said something right then. I should have stood up and pointed at the slide and screamed, "That's mine, you smug, loaf-wearing spreadsheet thief." But instead, I stared at my laptop screen and typed what he said, as if I were the stenographer to my own erasure. After the meeting, I walked straight to HR. Karen, the HR partner, which is just fancy talk for corporate babysitter, looked up from her keyboard and smiled the way people do when they're hoping you've come to ask about yoga reimbursements or chili cook-offs. "I need to file an attribution concern," I said. "Oh." She tapped at her keyboard like I'd just told her my badge wasn't working. "Tell me more." I gave her the rundown, the timestamps, the file version history, the original draft of the deck where my name sat right there on the cover page. I even had Slack messages where Greg complimented the proposal before mysteriously consolidating it. When I finished, she didn't look surprised. She looked tired. Tired of girls like me, maybe. Tired of messy truths. "Well, technically, you're still considered a junior support resource," she said gently, as if I'd confused myself. "Greg is your direct manager, and final attribution for internal initiatives usually falls to senior leadership." "But it was my analysis," I said. She smiled again. "We don't negotiate with junior staff, Anna." There it was. The sentence that would burn itself into my bloodstream. "We don't negotiate with junior staff." Like I was a child who'd accidentally wandered into the adults' table at Thanksgiving. Like I hadn't been the one elbow deep in spreadsheets for the last 4 months, fixing broken procurement logic no one else wanted to touch. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't threaten. I just nodded slowly. "Right," I said, "of course. Could I get a printed copy of my original onboarding contract, please, just for compliance reasons?" Karen blinked. "Sure. That's a first," she said, half joking. She printed it, stapled it, slid it across the desk like she was handing me a pity brochure. It felt heavier than it should have, not in weight, just in consequence. I thanked her and tucked it into my bag, then walked past Greg's office. He was on the phone, laughing, probably recounting the victory to someone, maybe lining up a chat with the VP of Ops. I didn't stop. I didn't even look at him. But I did take the stairs, all 14 flights, with that packet of paper pressed to my chest like it might start glowing if I held it tight enough. I didn't know what I was looking for yet, but I knew something was buried in there. Something they hadn't read. Something they'd all forgotten. Something they didn't think someone like me would ever dare to look for. They thought I'd sulk, maybe rage quit, or drown in some whisper campaign about not being a team player. Instead, I went home, made tea, and spread the contract across my kitchen table. Then I started reading. Every single word. The contract was printed on that thick, plasticky paper they used to make things look official enough to ignore. Like something you'd never think to touch again unless someone threatened to fire you or name a sandwich after you in the cafeteria. Mine had the Trinican Systems logo watermarked faintly in the background, just behind every clause like it was judging you for reading them. I sat cross-legged on my floor, a half-eaten bowl of leftover pad thai getting cold beside me, and started reading. The kind of reading where every sentence feels like it's written to confuse you just enough to give up. Paragraphs stacked like wet towels. Subsections nested like Russian dolls. And everywhere that thick aroma of legalese, hereinafter referred to as irrevocably bound to in accordance with Section 4, Clause B, like a spellbook with a caffeine addiction. But I read it every single page. By page 4, my eyes were burning. By page 5, I'd started talking to myself. "This is all boilerplate," I muttered. Non-disparagement, arbitration clause, non-disclosure, corporate code of conduct, blah, 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 and then I flipped to page 6. It didn't look like the rest of the contract. The margins were tighter, the font slightly off, like someone had copy-pasted from another document, and the formatting didn't quite line up. At the top in bold were the words, Section 12, Founder's Operational Continuity Clause. I stopped chewing. It read, any employee classified as a contributor to internal innovation pipelines within the first 36 months of employment shall, upon verified implementation of said contribution, be entitled to a. Status elevation for purposes of scope sign-off, b. Access to equity renegotiation proceedings, and c. Veto power on future iterations of said contribution, if codified under internal IP tracking protocols. My eyes ran over that again. Then again. I read it 5 times before I even realized I'd stopped breathing. And at the bottom, 2 signatures. One was mine. Sloppy, rushed. I was probably still thinking about whether the break room fridge would have oat milk. The other? E. Travers, Elliot Travers, the founder. Back when I joined, Elliot was still around, barely. White-bearded, half-checked out, still shuffling through the halls in Hawaiian shirts like a tech Santa Claus with a Bluetooth headset. Everyone knew he was preparing for strategic transition, which is exec speak for I'm tired of this place and the money's good enough to walk. But I remembered him. He sat in on my onboarding review, looked at my rotation summary and said, keep your eyes on the gaps. No one ever bothers to look there. I thought he was just being poetic. Turns out the bastard had buried a nuclear bomb in the fine print. The clause wasn't even secret. It just wasn't advertised. Not in the employee handbook. Not in the welcome to Trinican onboarding packet. I doubt even half the legal team remembered it existed. I flipped the page to the appendix references. There it was again, Appendix D, marked Dormant Clause Legacy Innovation Incentive. Dormant, not dead, it had a timestamp valid for the first 36 months of employment. I checked the date at the top of my contract. March 17th. It was now February 12th, 34 months and 26 days, less than 5 weeks to expiration. I sat back and stared at the ceiling. My proposal, the one Greg stole, had already been pushed live. Legal implementation, budget shifts, vendor terminations, the whole machine in motion. Meaning the clause had been triggered. Verified implementation of internal contribution. Tick. That meant I wasn't just the creator of the idea, they'd officially certified me as one, even if they didn't know it. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from clarity. That sharp, awful kind that cuts through humiliation like a scalpel. Greg hadn't just stolen my work. By launching it, he'd unknowingly activated the exact clause that gave me power. In HR, they hadn't read it. Karen hadn't even blinked when she printed the contract. No flag, no alert, just a dumb smile and a stapler. I reached for my laptop and pulled up the original draft of the proposal. The one saved in my personal drive with version tracking intact. Timestamp changes. Slack messages cross-linked. Then I opened our internal document management system and downloaded the final approved rollout memo, authored by Greg, but containing my original diagrams. I compared the two, nearly identical. My formatting, my phrasing, my ROI projection graph, even the typo in the x-axis label. He hadn't even fixed the typo. God, I whispered, idiots. They buried gold and handed me the shovel. It wasn't rage, not yet. Rage is messy, loud. Bustable, what I felt was something colder, like a chess player seeing 10 moves ahead, like watching a storm roll in and realizing it's moving exactly where you need it to go. I stood up, walked to my printer, and printed a single clean page. Then I went back to the contract, traced the language with my finger, and copied the exact wording of Section 12C. And at the bottom of that page, I carefully reattached Elliot Travers' signature, scanned original from my onboarding folder. I slid the page into a new folder labeled Operational Continuity Renegotiation. Then I made tea, then I slept. And when I woke up, I smiled, because now, finally, I knew how this ended. The hardest part wasn't drafting the document. It wasn't choosing the language or referencing the right clause. I knew exactly what to write. I'd read that damn contract like it was scripture. Every comma mattered. Every subsection was a weapon if you read it with the right kind of spite. The hardest part was how calm I had to be while doing it. I wasn't allowed to look angry. Not online, not in Slack, not even in the hallway. I couldn't afford the kind of micro-expression that would alert the Gregs and Karens of the world that I was anything other than totally fine, just a little tired. They were like vultures, circling for weakness dressed in Ann Taylor. I waited until Friday. End of day, not because it was poetic, but because it was procedural. Every Friday, HR logged document submissions before the system wiped temp flags for the week. That meant mine would enter the stack silently. No alerts, no review queues, just a quiet paper trail sliding into the inbox of someone too hungover to read legalese until Monday. I printed the writer on the same type of paper Karen had used. Thick, with the watermark. I even borrowed her stapler that morning and handed it back like I was about to post a job ad for Team Mascot. The wording was surgically precise. Per Section 12C of the Founder's Operational Continuity Clause, effective March 17th, year redacted. This rider confirms the triggering of renegotiation eligibility based on verified implementation of protected internal IP contributions, requesting elevation to eligible scope authority status and review of equity adjustment eligibility per contractual obligation. See attached documentation for reference. Signature attached for continuity. Anna G. Attachment. Original contract signature, E. Travers. I signed it at my kitchen table, black ink on cold white, hand steady as if I were mailing a wedding invitation to someone I planned to divorce. Then I opened the internal HR portal, one of those clunky SharePoint knockoffs with gray buttons and passive-aggressive tooltips, and submitted it to the contractual review folder under the role development category. Technically, I was requesting renegotiation. Legally, I was triggering a clause with built-in obligations, the kind no one bothers to look for until the consequences show up with a badge and an attorney. 10 minutes later, I got a response. Not from legal, not from a VP, from Karen, of course. The reply was short, sweet, and dripping with that HR-certified condescension you can't buy in stores. Hi, Anna, received. We'll add this to your personnel file. Love the enthusiasm, lol. Most staff wait until year 5 for renegotiation, but hey, gotta respect the energy. Cheers, Karen, I stared at the screen. Lol, she wrote, like I'd just submitted a Pinterest board of dream job titles. Like the founder's signature wasn't real. Like the clause didn't matter because I wasn't someone who mattered. They hadn't read it, not really, not past the first 2 lines. Probably thought it was one of those vague just-in-case career growth memos you send after attending a corporate mindfulness workshop. Perfect. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. They thought they'd seen the game, that I was bluffing with a low pair and a cute smile, but I wasn't playing poker. I was planting a landmine under the conference table. The moment she uploaded that PDF to my file without escalation, without routing it through legal, they triggered the trap themselves. Compliance protocols required a full review of any clause-based rider if it included legacy executive signatures. Failure to initiate that review within 5 business days was a breach of internal governance policy, and they wouldn't catch it until Monday, when the paper trail would already be timestamped, and the rider would already be in the system. When the lol in Karen's email would sit 3 lines above a founder's signature they forgot still carried weight. I took a deep breath, stood from my desk, and walked past her office. She was at her standing desk, earbuds in, probably listening to some podcast about corporate synergy or authenticity as a service. I gave her a little wave. She waved back without looking. Then she rolled her eyes. I saw it. That little eye roll that says you tried, sweetie. Like she'd just flicked a bug off her blouse. That's when I smiled. Not fake smiled, not polite smiled. I smiled like a wolf that's already hidden the bones, and then I walked out. Past the HR bulletin board with its women in leadership, flyers still curling at the corners. Past Greg's office, where he was laughing on speakerphone again, probably spitballing more ways to monetize other people's ideas. I didn't stop, didn't turn, didn't breathe, until I got outside into the sharp, frozen air. I wasn't scared. I wasn't angry. I was waiting. Because now it was no longer about whether they respected my work. It was about whether they'd survive what happened when they didn't. They say you should never schedule a meeting before your second cup of coffee. At 8:59 a.m. on Monday, the CFO didn't give a damn about that. I was already at my desk when his assistant power walked over like her heels were chasing her. Anna, Mr. Delacroix wants you in the 10th floor conference room. Now, no subject line, no calendar invite, no smile. Just now, I didn't ask questions. I just saved my work, stood up, and grabbed a notepad I didn't need. Paper makes people nervous. It looks like you're documenting things. I hadn't written a thing on it yet, but that didn't matter. Reception was half the battle. The other half was timing, and mine was exquisite. The glass door to the 10th floor conference room slammed shut behind me with a hiss like an angry parent. Delacroix was already standing, waving a printout over his head like he was swatting flies. His tie was loose, face flushed pink like the numbers on his quarterly burn rate projection. This, he barked, shaking the paper, this is a joke, right? I stepped forward, set my notepad down, and tilted my head. Which part? Don't play coy with me, he snapped, thrusting the sheet toward me. You submitted this thing to HR? With Elliot's signature attached? Who do you think you are? I didn't blink, I didn't smile. I just reached forward, flipped the page over gently, and pointed to the bottom right corner. The signature, E. Travers, ink signed, digitally scanned. Original file metadata embedded. You're holding a founder-executed clause from my employment contract, I said quietly. Page 6, Section 12C, triggered upon verified implementation of internal innovation IP. Confirmed by your own rollout memo last week. He stared at me like I'd just recited Sanskrit. That clause is dormant, he muttered. It was a legacy relic. Dormant doesn't mean void, I replied. His hand dropped to the table. The paper fluttered downward, landing like a flag on a conquered battlefield. His eyes darted around the room as if looking for someone to back him up. That's when he barked toward the hallway, get legal, now. 2 minutes later, Jenna from compliance entered, buttoned up, hair taut, expression already exhausted. She carried a laptop and a clipboard which told me everything I needed to know. She'd been briefed on something, but not enough. Anna, hi, she said politely. So I understand there's a bit of confusion about a clause? Not confusion, I said, just a timeline issue. I submitted a legally enforceable rider under Section 12C of the Founders Clause. HR logged it into the personnel system on Friday. No escalation. That qualifies as acknowledgement. Delacroix jumped in, eyes twitching. She's a junior analyst. There are standard protocols. No junior-level staff has renegotiation rights, let alone project veto authority. This is a clear overstep, Jenna held up one finger. Delacroix shut up like someone pressed mute on his vocal cords. She sat down, opened her laptop, and pulled up the document. I knew when she found it because her face went still. Founders Clause, Section 12. Paragraph C, she murmured. Triggered by verified implementation? Eligible for renegotiation and scope sign-off. Veto rights on derivative initiatives. Her voice trailed off as she scrolled. Then she stopped and looked up. Who approved the rollout of her proposal? Delacroix looked at me, then at the ceiling, then at his shoes. I believe I mean the operations team deemed it, so you implemented it? He didn't answer. Jenna clicked a few more times. And you attached her documentation in the Series C summary deck? We reused some material, which included her models. She's internal staff, which invokes attribution protection under Appendix D. She finished flatly, not even looking at him. She turned to me, cool and composed. Anna, did you submit supporting materials with this writer? Yes, I said. Original draft, timestamp metadata, Slack confirmations, version history. Everything Greg reused is logged. Delacroix groaned into his palm. Jenna's eyes didn't move. And was the founder's signature on your original employment contract? Yes, she sat back, exhaled slowly, and looked at HR. Karen had materialized during the last few minutes, standing awkwardly near the doorway like she hoped no one would notice she existed. Her arms were crossed so tightly I thought she might snap a rib. I assumed it was symbolic, Karen said weakly. A morale clause, we've never enforced that one. Jenna stared at her like she'd just admitted to flushing company laptops down the toilet. You logged a founder-signed clause with binding equity implications into a junior employee's file without routing it through legal? Karen stammered, I didn't think that. Jenna interrupted, is the problem. The room went quiet, like hospital waiting room quiet, like we just found a virus in production quiet. I didn't speak, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because silence, in moments like these, speaks louder than any clever monologue. Delacroix leaned on the table with both hands, his face sinking into something that looked suspiciously like fear. What does this mean? He asked. Jenna closed her laptop. It means she's not junior staff anymore. Legally, she's a protected contributor. She holds interim co-signatory rights over any innovation initiative tied to that IP scope, including the proposal you used in your investor filings. Karen turned white. Delacroix sat down. I stood still. Like ice in a glass. Let them feel it melt. I didn't hear anything for 36 hours. No Slack messages, no emails, no thinly veiled calendar invites labeled touch base. Just a humming silence from the executive floor, as if the building itself had taken a breath and didn't know how to exhale. It was beautiful. Tuesday came and went. I spent it buried in vendor compliance logs, pretending like I hadn't just detonated a legacy clause that made the CFO look like he'd rubber-stamped a poison pill into an investor pitch. I stayed late, took notes, made sure to comment on 2 Jira tickets, and even brought donuts for the floor on Wednesday morning. That's when they blinked. At 10:14 a.m., a meeting mysteriously appeared on my calendar. No organizer, no details, just the subject line, Career Alignment Discussion Ops/HR. Clicked it open. Location, Conference Room 7A, time, 11 o'clock a.m. Attendees, Karen from HR, Greg of course, and someone I didn't recognize, T. Robbins, Strategic Counsel. I knew the name, Internal Legal. The kind they send when things are going off the rails but they don't want it to look like a full evacuation yet. I accepted the invite, didn't write anything, didn't prepare anything, just printed one email and tucked it into a folder. I walked in at 10:58 and let the silence build for exactly 7 seconds before sitting down. Karen smiled like a hostage trying to sell you a timeshare. Anna, so glad you could join us. We wanted to take a moment to, step back from the documents and have a human conversation. Greg cleared his throat. He was sweating. His tie had a ketchup stain. Look, no one's saying you didn't do great work. But sometimes these old clauses are more ceremonial, legacy stuff. Robbins, the lawyer, didn't say a word, just tapped a pen on his legal pad like he was counting beats. Karen leaned in. We think there might have been a misinterpretation. Founders' clauses are tricky. We're exploring whether yours was fully ratified. I raised an eyebrow. Is that so? Technically it was signed, Greg jumped in, but that doesn't always mean it was intended to be activated in perpetuity. Of course, Karen said, nodding furiously. And that's why we're hoping you might reconsider the rider you submitted. We're happy to open a development track conversation. Maybe something like an internal fellowship, with Greg as your sponsor. Greg smiled like he was being knighted with a broken broom handle. And of course, Karen added, we're offering a generous incentive package, discretionary equity, soft exit options if that's your preference. You'd retain credit for your work, and we all walk away happy. That's when I opened the folder. Before we get into offers, I said, laying the page gently in front of Robin's, you'll want to review this. It was an email, dated 33 months ago, sent from Elliot Travers to me, CCing two now retired execs. Subject, onboarding summary Anna G. The body was short. Anna, your work identifying operational redundancies during your rotation was sharp. The vendor matrix alone saved us six figures last quarter. That's real innovation. We'll be watching your path closely. E.T. Beneath it in all its time-stamped glory was a PDF attachment. Anna G. Onboarding Rotation Summary PDF. Robbins took the paper, read it twice, then slid it silently into his folder. Greg's face had gone a shade of gray normally reserved for freezer burn. Karen was already blinking like she was trying to dislodge a memory. I believe, I said, that qualifies as recognition of contribution during the protected window. And since the current project iteration is based on those same contributions, I didn't finish the sentence. Robbins did, quietly. She holds standing. Karen looked at him, panicked. But what about jurisdictional layering? Can't we nullify the rider based on non-contemporaneous triggering? Not if the original clause was executed by the founder, Robbins said, which it was. Greg leaned forward, voice cracking. So she can what? Cancel projects now? I folded my hands, only the ones based on stolen work. Silence. Robbins cleared his throat. We'll update the board accordingly. Anna, thank you for your time. I stood slowly, nodded once and left. No mic drop, no clever line. Just the quiet of someone who knew the difference between a request and a right. By Thursday, legal had filed an internal advisory notice to the board. Section 12, C of the Founders Clause, is binding and enforceable. Anna G. is to be treated as co-signatory authority for all project scopes derivative of her IP contribution matrix as outlined in onboarding documentation and subsequent implementation. The phrase co-signatory authority rippled through the building like an earthquake no one wanted to acknowledge. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even smile. I just updated my internal wiki access, added myself to two private project channels, and reviewed the scope calendar for the next 3 quarters. There were 3 more initiatives scheduled that borrowed directly from my original framework, and now, they couldn't touch a single one without my signature. Let them try. The funny thing about power is how quickly people forget who holds it, until a line in a PDF reminds them. It started with a ping. Just after 2:00 p.m. on Friday, I received a chirpy little Slack message from someone I'd never interacted with before. Jenna Y., Special Projects Liaison for Investor Relations. Hi Anna. Quick question, can you confirm whether your original vendor consolidation efficiency matrix was included in the Series C materials? No rush, just tidying up some post-filing compliance stuff. Thanks. I stared at the message for a full minute. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because the tone was so casual, like she was asking if I'd left a Tupperware in the break room. Like my intellectual property was a missing lunchbox. I replied with the same surface-level calm. Hi, Jenna. Yes, the original matrix was submitted by me during onboarding and restructured into a formal proposal under my authorship. The final deck used for Series C included visual assets and phrasing pulled directly from that proposal, confirmed via internal timestamps. Best, Anna, 2 hours later, I was CC'd on a compliance request email from Jenna's department to legal. Subject, urgent attribution clarification/Series C documentation. Buried in the email was a sentence that changed everything. As per governance bylaws, the use of protected internal innovation tied to a founder's clause contributor must retain documented attribution in all external-facing materials or risk breach of clause terms. That sentence was the corporate equivalent of sticking a grenade into a blender. By Monday morning, I had 5 meeting invites. None from Greg, none from Karen. All from people with counsel, director, or investor relations in their titles. And the founder? He'd been looped in too. The one who signed that clause. The one they'd all politely tried to forget. The internal Series C deck wasn't just using my numbers, it had copied formatting. Headings. Phrasing lifted directly from my onboarding report. My language, cleaned up by marketing, maybe, but still mine. And under the founder's clause, that meant something. Specifically, it meant I couldn't be removed from the attribution chain without violating a binding governance agreement. And that's when the ripple became a wave. The investor group had caught wind of the clause through a routine diligence check. Their legal team had been combing through executive compensation structures and stumbled onto the clause buried in my file because someone finally did read what I submitted. And now they wanted answers. A formal audit was requested. They called it attribution verification, but everyone knew what it was: panic mitigation. The clause stipulated that if a protected contributor's name was removed from IP documentation without documented consent, the filing could be considered materially incomplete, which meant regulatory exposure, which meant a delay in the Series C round, which meant millions in vaporized valuation. I got an email from Delacroix himself at 11:42 a.m. Anna, appreciate your clarity on this matter. We're working through some internal adjustments. Would love to discuss options for recognition and alignment moving forward. Please advise when you're available this week. MD, recognition and alignment, like I just won a Gotham sales raffle. That afternoon, I walked into a hastily assembled working group debrief with legal, investor relations, and two people from strategic ops who looked like they'd rather be cleaning crime scenes. The deck was on the screen. My deck. Just cleaner fonts and a corporate logo. Whose name is on the original draft of this matrix? One of the IR directors asked. Everyone looked at me. Mine, I said. And was it removed from the investor deck? Yes, I said. Greg replaced the author field with Trinican internal ops. I wasn't informed. Jenna from IR looked like she'd just swallowed a tack. Legal cleared their throat. The clause specifies that removal of attribution without consent constitutes a material governance breach. And that breach, if not corrected, triggers what? One of the directors asked. A reclassification of the deck as non-compliant, legal replied. The room went very still, because that word non-compliant meant the filings had to be amended, which meant re-signing things, which meant revisiting timelines, which meant calling back investors who'd already popped the champagne. It meant egg, everywhere, on every face. We can correct the attribution, someone said. Just add her name retroactively, not enough. Legal snapped. She also qualifies for co-signatory rights on iterations derived from her contribution. More silence, and if she declines, the director asked. Everyone looked at me again. I said nothing. Just folded my hands and stared at the screen. My screen. My name was missing from it, but not for long. I waited. Because now they understood what the founder's clause actually meant. And I wasn't negotiating anymore. I was deciding. The calendar invite landed like a cold slap. Subject line, urgent, special session IP governance clarification attendees, board members confidential required participants, Anna G., General Counsel, IR Director, CFO time, Friday, 9 a.m. sharp location, executive conference room, a plus Zoom, founder link enclosed, no greeting, no explanation, just a link, and my name. I stared at it for a long second, not because I was surprised, I'd been expecting this, but because of who else was invited. The founder, Elliot Travers. It wasn't a guess. The email included his initials in the Zoom link ID, Travers Founder Room Private. Internal IT doesn't even generate those unless they're logged as VIPs. The man who hadn't been seen on company property in nearly 2 years. The man who'd signed my contract. The man who'd buried the founder's clause like a lit fuse wrapped in fine print. They'd called him, which meant the board was scared. Good. I spent the next few hours preparing, not with graphs or decks or buzzwords, but with one thing, proof. I printed everything, timestamps, version histories, Slack confirmations, internal wiki edit logs, the email from Travers, the original proposal, the rollout memo from Ops, even the marketing summary that repurposed my phrasing into invest-ready taglines. I didn't need to argue, I needed to document. By Thursday night, my living room looked like a war table. Yellow sticky notes lined the table edge with labels, IP transfer trail, attribution history, clause enforcement timeline. Each stack was color-coded, clipped, and copied. I scanned the entire packet into a single PDF and emailed it to myself at 11:57 p.m. Subject line, board presentation support ag. Just in case someone tried to lose the printed copy. I didn't sleep, not out of fear, out of calculation. I was counting variables, playing out moves like a chess game with careers as the pawns. By 8:30 a.m. Friday, I was already in the parking garage. I wore black, not because I was mourning, but because it made me vanish against their glass walls and leather chairs. I wasn't there to dazzle. I was there to bury a lie with receipts. Executive conference room had floor-ceiling windows and one of those $1,000 glass tables nobody actually uses. It looked like the set of a pharmaceutical ad, modern, cold, sterile. The board was seated in a semicircle of discomfort. Delacroix was already sweating through his shirt. Greg, mercifully, wasn't present. Karen sat near the door, pretending to type but mostly just watching the floor like it might swallow her whole. Legal was there, 2 of them this time, and Jenna from IR looked like she hadn't slept in a week. At exactly 9 a.m., the screen lit up. There he was, Elliot Travers. Hair longer now, maybe grayer, beard grown in like he'd given up on shaving the same day he gave up caring about the stock price. He looked bored, until his eyes landed on me. He smiled, a small one. Morning, he said. His voice was calm, unhurried, no one answered. The chair of the board, someone I'd never actually spoken to, cleared her throat. Let's begin. Delacroix jumped in like a man falling on a grenade. We've convened to clarify a discrepancy regarding intellectual property attribution related to internal operational proposals and their representation in Series C materials. There appears to have been a clause, an outdated clause that created confusion around. It's not outdated, I said. They all turned. It was signed 34 months ago, I continued. Activated via verified implementation. Binding. No expiration except by contract amendment, which never occurred. Legal shifted uncomfortably. Jenna stopped blinking. I slid the folder across the table. This is the full record, I said. Drafted under my name, submitted, implemented, used without attribution in the Series C investor deck. No one moved, and the clause? The board chair asked quietly. I opened the folder to page 6. Founder's Operational Continuity Clause, I said. Section 12C, co-signatory authority over derivative initiatives stemming from verified internal contributions. Founder signed. Travers leaned back on screen, fingers steepled. I remember signing that, he said, with a tone like someone remembering a particularly satisfying glass of bourbon. The chair turned to him. Elliot, do you recall the intent of that clause? He didn't hesitate to protect people like her. Like her meaning, people who saw the cracks before we painted over them. Delacroix tried to interject. But she's not, she is, Travers said, cutting him off. The clause is valid. It was triggered. You used her work, you removed her name. You tried to bury it under a stack of rebranded PDFs. That's not governance. That's theft with a font change. Silence. Then the board chair spoke again, slowly. So you're saying this company is currently in breach of an enforceable clause, signed by a founder and relevant to active investor materials? Travers nodded once. Unless she agrees to remediate, all eyes fell on me. I didn't move, didn't blink, didn't smile. I just said, I'll answer any questions you have. Because I was ready. Let them ask, let them beg, let them squirm. I'd brought the matches. Now they could choose whether we lit candles or burned it all down. The clause hit harder when spoken out loud. Everyone in the room had read it by now or claimed they had, but reading something silently and hearing it reverberate off glass walls are two different animals. One is theoretical. The other is a guillotine lowering 1 inch at a time. The general counsel's voice was steady, but not confident, like a pastor who didn't quite believe the sermon he was preaching. Any employee classified as a contributor to internal innovation pipelines within the first 36 months of employment shall, upon verified implementation of said contribution, be entitled to A. Status elevation for purposes of scope sign-off, B. Access to equity renegotiation proceedings, C. Veto power on future iterations of said contribution, S. If codified under internal IP tracking protocols. He paused. The paper trembled slightly in his hand. Then he turned the page and read the final line. All stipulations above are binding upon execution and require no secondary ratification if co-signed by a founder. He didn't need to say whose signature was on it. Everyone already knew. Travers, still projected on the wall via Zoom, didn't speak right away. He just blinked slowly, then leaned forward into the camera like he was trying to look through the boardroom table and into someone's soul. I remember signing that, he said. Calm, clean, no hesitation. No one moved, not the board chair, who was now gripping her armrest like it was keeping her from floating off the planet. Not the VP of Ops, whose coffee had gone untouched since minute 2. And certainly not Delacroix, whose expression now hovered somewhere between flop, sweat, and religious revelation. A man halfway to a nervous breakdown and finally understanding the math problem he failed in high school. Someone, one of the external directors, I think, murmured under their breath, did we really give her signature power on internal innovation filings? No one answered, because the answer was sitting right there on the table. On page 6. I didn't speak. I didn't smile. I just watched them all do the math. The clause didn't give me suggestion rights. It gave me veto power on every single initiative derived from that original framework, including but not limited to the operational restructuring plan, the Tier 2 vendor consolidation roadmap, and the 3-year profitability forecast that was now the backbone of their Series C pitch. If I withheld my consent, they couldn't file updated documents. If they couldn't file, the round would stall. If the round stalled, 2 of the board members had vesting tranches tied to it. And if that happened, well, let's just say you'd be able to hear the screaming from the stock room. Delacroix broke first. He wasn't looking at anyone in particular, just staring at the clause like it might rewrite itself if he squinted hard enough. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaled through his nose, and finally whispered, we should have just promoted her. It wasn't a question, wasn't even regret. It was an obituary for a version of the company that thought it could survive on shortcuts and charm. The chair turned to general counsel. What are the options? He glanced at me, then at Travers on the screen. There are no options, not unless she waives her rights or enters a renegotiation voluntarily. Would she? The chair asked. I don't know, he said. Would you? All eyes landed on me. I let the silence sit. Not for drama, but because silence, in rooms like that, is a scalpel. It slices through pretense. It forces people to sit with the weight of what they've ignored. I looked at the founder. He gave me a single nod, small, almost imperceptible. Then I looked at Delacroix. I offered transparency, I said. I submitted it through the right channels. I didn't hide it. I didn't threaten anyone. I followed the policy that he helped write. I pointed at Travers. You chose to ignore it. No one argued because they couldn't. This wasn't about innovation anymore, or policy, or governance. This was about a mistake with a signature at the bottom. Their mistake, and I was the signature. The offer came in a manila folder like it was being delivered in secret to a spy about to change sides. Delacroix didn't present it himself. He couldn't even look me in the eye. It was the board chair who handed it to me, hands flat on the table, as if trying to make the paper feel less like surrender. I'd like to resolve this collaboratively, she said. Translation: we'd like to stop hemorrhaging money and dignity in front of our investors. Inside, an advisory role that was a soft exile padded with buzzwords. Senior strategic consultant. No team, no direct reports. Just a very expensive seat at a table no one wanted me to speak at. A signing bonus. Retroactive equity backdated to the date of implementation, pegged just low enough to be a courtesy and just high enough to be spun as generous. And a non-disparagement clause so aggressively detailed I half expected it to ban me from sarcastic glances. I read the offer while they waited. No one spoke. They were sure I'd take it, that I'd fold, that I'd melt into gratitude like every other employee who'd ever been told they were lucky to be in the room. They thought this would feel like a gift. It didn't. Felt like hush money dressed up in PowerPoint. I slid the folder back across the table. I decline. You could hear the air molecules in the room stop moving. The chair blinked. Excuse me? I decline, I repeated. I don't want an advisory role. I don't need retroactive equity to feel whole. And I'm not interested in disappearing quietly. Delacroix finally looked up like someone just slapped him out of anesthesia. You'd rather, what? Stay junior staff. I smiled, but not kindly. I'd like to retain internal publishing rights on any documents tied to the proposal. That's all. Silence. Jenna from IR frowned. Why? Continuity, I said. If you're going to build on something, I'd like the opportunity to ensure consistency. The board conferred quietly. It sounded like a pack of lawyers trying not to breathe too loud. Eventually, the chair nodded. That seems reasonable. It was more than reasonable. It was stupid. Because what they didn't realize was that publishing rights, once embedded into documentation logs, created a digital fingerprint. A mandatory co-author tag across every future initiative that evolved from my framework, every cost-cutting measure, every operational reorg, every proposal Greg or anyone else thought they could bury under a new name. They'd never again be able to erase me from the page. Not without rewriting the DNA of half their business logic. All they'd see from here on out was, last edited by, Anna G., and that's all I needed. The meeting ended without fanfare. The founder gave me a half smile through the screen and quietly signed off. One by one, the board members left the room like retreating priests after a failed exorcism. Delacroix lingered. He didn't say anything. Just watched me gather my papers. His mouth opened like he wanted to say something, apologize, maybe, or warn me, or beg. I didn't wait to find out. I walked out, down the hallway, past the silent stretch of executive offices and award plaques and team photos no one looked at anymore. And that's when I saw it. In the CFO's office, behind the glass, the original page from my contract. Page 6. Framed, hung right above a bookshelf full of corporate strategy books no one had opened since the merger. And beneath the frame, taped with yellow adhesive like a middle school locker note, read everything. I stopped, just for a second, then kept walking. Because sometimes revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it's a line in a contract. Sometimes it's a name that won't come off the documents no matter how hard they scrub. And sometimes, it's just knowing that the next time they try to rewrite history, they'll have to spell it with my name on top. Thanks for watching, you cubicle warriors. Hit that subscribe button. Unless you're my old boss, then you're on your own. Revenge of the coffee pot strikes again.